I'm actually feeling a bit more positive about the future now. Obviously, we all have a lot of new things to learn, and one of the most important skills to master is facing changes in life bravely and enthusiastically. Hopefully, our next speaker will help us with it because there's a lot of changes going on. Let's listen to Stephen Duggan, Vice President of Terawe and Governing Board Member of the UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies and Education, which is a huge title, but he's been a teacher for about 30 years. He's going to tell us about the different methods of effective teaching and studying.
Hello, my name is Stephen Duggan. I'm Vice President of Terawe, a global technology services and solutions company, and a member of the governing board of the UNESCO Institute for Information Technologies and Education, where I represent the global IT industry. I'm also the father of 6 kids. I have had the extraordinary good fortune to work in education for more than 30 years, beginning my career as a teacher of English literature. My job, over a dozen years, was to encourage the creative spirit of over 1,800 young people, while simultaneously trying to convince them that the conventions of the pastoral elegy would be of some importance to them in their future lives. I graduated early from university, which meant that on my first day as a student teacher, I had to face a class of 25 18-year-olds, despite the fact that I was a little more than a year older than they were. Needless to say, I didn't share that fact with them. Teaching was a job I loved throughout the 12 years I spent in the classroom. My students were aged between 13 and 18, and I was constantly impressed and surprised by their imagination, their creativity, and their passion. There have been many education heroes over the past year, but we should not forget their fortitude and determination as they pursued their studies in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, separated from their peers and their closest friends, and often having to attend school remotely in a quiet or less than quiet corner of their homes. I left teaching to join Microsoft as an education subject matter expert and spent many years there, most latterly as Microsoft's Director of Worldwide Education Strategy. It was a job that allowed me to travel across the globe and to meet with and learn from extraordinary educators and thought leaders. Among the many highlights were a day I spent with the Nobel Prize-winning Irish poet Seamus Heaney. I got to be in the class when a class of autistic inner-city Dublin kids reduced astronaut Neil Armstrong to helpless laughter. What happened? Kids on the spectrum, I've one of my own, are not easily impressed. He had no sooner introduced himself as the most expensive delivery man in history than a boy at the back of the class raised his hand. "All we ever hear about," he said, "is you and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. What about the other guy? None of you ever mentions him." "What guy?" Armstrong replied, both puzzled and, I suspect, quietly amused to have finally been asked a question he hadn't faced before in 40 years of doing events like this. "The guy who took the photos," the young student replied. And though he laughed, Armstrong also took the time to explain how the photographs of himself and Buzz Aldrin on the surface had been set up to include them both, though I'm not sure that the boy was convinced. On a separate occasion, I was invited by a wonderful educator called Lucy Lee Malazzi to co-teach a class of 156 students in a ramshackle classroom in Lesotho, Southern Africa. Many of those children so determined to gain an education that they had walked 4 hours or more to school that morning, despite their teacher having only 15 copies of their textbook, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, to share amongst all of the students crushed into that single room. A simple piece of technology transformed that situation, by the way. We left behind a small battery-powered projector, which enabled Lucy Lee to project the text of the play onto a sheet hung over the blackboard, allowing every student in the room to see the lines of the play as she thought. I've watched technology gain a foothold in schools, moving from computer rooms with lines of enormous grey and black boxes into the classroom and onto the teacher's desk, and then into each student's backpack. I've also witnessed a new divide between the rich and the poor peoples of the world open up, as a huge gap emerged between those who had access to devices and the internet and those for whom such things were an impossible dream. We've seen that gap emerge once again over the past year with the shift to remote learning, with significant numbers of children entirely cut off from their education because they lacked the basic requirements of a device, a connection to the internet, and a quiet place in which to study. Even today, 37% of homes across the globe have no connection to the internet. And for students requiring additional support or accommodations, be that because they have an intellectual or physical disability, or face any of the myriad of challenges that require additional resources and support, the past few months have been a disaster. During my career, however, I've also seen huge shifts in education philosophy and practice, with a move away from rote learning and the old model of the sage on the stage, with teachers as instructors and children as the dumb recipients of knowledge. Much of that shift has come about because of the power of technology, which has enabled new pedagogies and modalities such as blended learning, and which has allowed students to direct their own learning outside of the classroom and the physical confines of time and place. Teachers can no longer act as the supreme authority on any subject when the kids in front of them can prove them wrong with just a simple search on their mobile phone. The global pandemic has shown us both the potential and the limitations of technology in education. It has, finally, drawn a line under the old argument about whether or not technology has any part to play in education or has any beneficial impact on teaching and learning. The laggards and the naysayers have had to rely on technology to continue to teach their classes or to connect their own kids to school, and discovered that it's actually not as scary or as difficult as they feared to do this through a computer screen. In regard to technology at least, you could argue that education has gone back a year, but advanced a decade. It has also added some new phrases to a teacher's vocabulary, such as "you're on mute," and woe betide the student who expressed their boredom or their dislike of their teacher without checking that the microphone was muted first. And in truth, how many of us even knew what our children were doing in school? Unless they were in primary school and we were regularly helping them with their homework, many of us had no idea what was in their textbooks or what they were learning at any given time. And it has been humbling to discover that our kids were right, that there are large parts of it that are boring and would most likely make us switch off too. That the teacher they've been complaining about all year really did have a voice so monotonous it would send a nest of angry wasps to sleep. But we also saw that there were brilliant teachers among them, ones who lit up a subject, who made it come alive and fostered a spark in your child that you may not have known was there. Teachers change lives. Ask anyone you know and they will tell you about that teacher. The one who saw something in them or set them on a path that they're still on today because they recognized a talent in them or awakened them to something which has continued to fascinate them all these long years later. That teacher. You're thinking of them now. I can't remember anyone ever telling me about that accountant. The pandemic tested teachers in new ways, and they rose to the challenge. I defy any parent who's had to homeschool their child over the past months to offer any criticism of that child's teacher. We no longer hear teachers described as lazy, or hear them berated for their long holidays or what is seen as their shorter working day. Parents have learned how much time it takes to prepare a class and how difficult it is to both assess and encourage a child, to point out a mistake they may have made without shattering their confidence or making them want to give up. And there are a few parents I know who felt that they needed a few weeks' holidays to recover by the end of their first week of homeschooling. It's not as easy as we thought, is it? And you need very particular skills to do it well. That is why we call it a profession. But parents too rose to the challenge. Forced to juggle work and their children's educational needs, they turned the family home into a school for several hours each day, dealing with the disruption and the anxiety of being responsible for their child succeeding or falling behind, at the same time as their own work life was being upended. Many of them, too, had to adjust to working remotely. Many of them also had to deal with the additional stress of being furloughed or laid off, with all of the financial and other pressures that entailed. And many, too, had to manage all of this and their children's schooling while dealing with the illness of a parent or relative of their own, or, in far too many cases, while grieving for the loss of a loved one. One of the things the pandemic has done has been to strengthen the bond between home and school, between teacher and parent, by giving us an insight into what our children's education involves on a day-to-day basis, and by truly sharing responsibility for the child's growth. And technology has provided the pillars which supported that bridge. Over the past year, I suspect there have been more instances of parents sitting alongside their children as they learned than has been the case in decades. There's been more communication between the home and the school through emails and daily bulletins and updates, and the school has truly come into the home via Zoom or Teams video links, which have opened millions of windows between the classroom and the family home. And it's not just the children who have continued to learn. We, as parents, have had many of the preconceptions we held both challenged and upended. We learned, for example, that being stuck in front of a screen was not what we thought it was at all. That in fact the screen or the Xbox was a way of connecting with their friends. That it was inordinately social rather than antisocial. Xbox Live and TikTok have been where most of my children's conversations with their peers have taken place over the past year. It's even at times where they've been getting most of their exercise. My daughter is not slumped in front of a screen when she's on TikTok. She's learning and performing new dance moves and making brilliant short movies for her friends. And technology has not stood still, not for an instant. The company I work for now, Terawe, is doing things with technology that even a year or so ago would have sounded like science fiction. Like using artificial intelligence and cognitive services to assess doctors in training on what we commonly describe as their bedside manner. Using sentiment analysis and emotion recognition to measure not just their ability to make an accurate diagnosis, but their ability to show kindness and empathy when having to give a patient or a loved one bad news. All of this by analysing video from multiple cameras filming multiple corridors and treatment rooms and providing that feedback in real time, so that our future doctors and nurses can develop and improve those skills as they learn, rather than grading them or failing them on their ability to do such things when the opportunity to learn has passed. I have had the tremendous good fortune to have always worked with people much more intelligent than I, and I include so many of the students I taught in that number, and have never felt more stupid than I have over the past few years as these technologies have evolved. But the opportunity to learn is always so much greater when you're the dumbest rather than the brightest person in the room. I think we've also learned to give our kids a break. Yes, we'd prefer that they spend all of their time concentrating hard on whatever lesson they were attending virtually, or that they'd spend as many hours studying or doing homework as they had before the lockdown. Though I have to admit here that I'm largely in favour of the Finnish approach to homework, which is not to give any in the first place. In general, homework is used to support rote learning and has little impact other than denying the children the opportunity to play and interact with their friends after they've already spent upwards of 6 hours of their day on their schoolwork. Before we criticise them for not applying themselves 100%, maybe we need to take a look at ourselves. Were we education heroes when it came to our own learning? Did we step up to the plate and deliver on the promises we made to ourselves when the first lockdown restricted us to our homes? When a visit to the supermarket became the equivalent of a weekend spent among the sidewalk cafes and art galleries of Paris? Did we actually train for that marathon? Did we stick to that diet, or master yoga, or baking, or origami, or do all of those jobs around the house or garden that we'd put off for years on the basis that we had to head off to work? I did finish writing a novel this year, but my French is as rudimentary as it ever was, and that shed still needs painting. The truth is that most of us were more likely to put on 20 pounds during the lockdown than to learn a new language. On a serious note, I think we do need to be particularly understanding and compassionate towards our children. Using the most optimistic of calculations, the pandemic has kept me largely confined to my home and separated from my friends and family for, at the most, 1 to 2% of my life. For my 10-year-old daughter, the lockdown has already lasted for 10% of her life. That's a significant amount of time kept away from her friends, not seeing her granny or granddad, perhaps having to deal with the death of a relative and not even given the chance to say a final farewell, of not being able to play her favourite sport, or just chat and laugh and run about, or make huge chalk drawings together on the pavement outside our home. And for teenagers, the struggles have been even greater. When it comes to student mental health, a reckoning is coming. And I say this as the parent of a son who has spent 3 of the last 12 months in a mental health institution, where he thankfully had access to the professional help that he needed. We were too late taking the simple steps needed to prevent a virus becoming a global pandemic. We thought optimism would protect us. We thought ignoring the scientists, ignoring the science, would somehow make the facts that science presented to us go away. A generation of children have been locked away from the most important supports that they have. And if you're the parent of a teenager, you know that that's not you. When you are 15 or 19, the people you rely on most are your peers, your friends. And after a year in isolation, that absence, that separation will have a cost. And when you were dealing with all of the stress and the uncertainty about who you are and how and where you fit in as a teenager, a year cut off from those supports constitutes and will create a crisis. When our doors open once more, there will be queues forming outside the incredibly limited resources offering support for young people with mental health challenges. We know this. We cannot again claim ignorance of what is in front of us or make excuses for our failure to prepare. As the saying goes, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. This will be a health crisis as important for the families who are affected as the virus itself. And, like the virus, it could claim many lives if we don't put the supports in place to care for those who most need help. Our students have been heroes, but like all heroes returning from a war, many of them will have wounds that need healing and injuries that can initially prove invisible. While being mindful that the COVID crisis is not over and will have long-term consequences that we need to prepare for, this forum is an opportunity to take stock of the learnings and to celebrate the fact that education has survived the greatest challenge of our generation. Students and their parents and teachers working in partnership have indeed been education heroes. This forum will give us the opportunity to hear from world leaders in the fields of education and child development, and educational experts from the press and media, and multinational organisations providing policy guidance to governments across the globe. I know it will be inspiring and provocative and an opportunity for all of us attending not only to reflect and to be entertained, but, most importantly of all, to learn.